The crystal chandelier vibrated with the heavy, suffocating silence in the VIP room. A notorious syndicate boss watched as his socialite wife sneered at a humble waitress, calling her an uneducated nobody. But when the waitress finally opened her mouth, the reigning queen of the underworld lost her crown in 60 seconds. The obsidian room at Le Trianon was not merely a private dining area. It was a sanctuary, where the invisible rulers of Chicago carved up the city over plates of white truffle risotto and $1,000 bottles of Bordeaux. The walls were lined with dark, acoustic mahogany, designed to swallow secrets. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the glittering skyline, keeping the wolves inside insulated from the world they preyed upon. Nora Hayes stood perfectly still in the corner of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her crisp, white apron. Her posture was impeccable, a stark contrast to the profound exhaustion aching in her bones. At 26, Nora was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in a high-rise corner office, utilizing her dual degrees in international law and forensic accounting. Instead, she was working double shifts, serving the city's most dangerous elite. A corporate sabotage scandal, orchestrated by a rival firm, had destroyed her father's legacy, leaving him with a crippling stroke and massive medical debts. Stripped of her career and blacklisted from the corporate world, Nora had retreated into the shadows of high-end hospitality, where the tips were large enough to keep her father's life support machines running. Tonight, the air in the restaurant was exceptionally thick. The general manager had been sweating profusely since 3 o'clock that afternoon, barking orders and polishing glasses until his hands bled. Silas Mercer was coming. Silas Mercer did not just run a crime syndicate. He operated a shadow empire. He controlled the shipping lanes, the unions, and a significant portion of the city's political infrastructure. He was a man of terrifying stillness, known for his bespoke suits, his calculating gray eyes, and a ruthlessness that was entirely devoid of passion. He treated violence not as an art, but as an administrative necessity. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the obsidian room opened. Silas entered first. He was tall, his presence immediately dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. Following closely behind him was his newly minted wife, Victoria. Victoria Sterling was the daughter of a corrupt state senator, a marriage arranged purely for political leverage and access to untraceable campaign funds. She was a striking woman, draped in vintage Dior and diamonds that caught the dim light like shards of ice. However, beneath the polished veneer, Victoria possessed the vicious, clawing insecurity of a woman who knew she was merely a strategic asset to her husband, not a partner. To compensate, she demanded absolute, groveling submission from anyone she deemed beneath her. Accompanying them was a foreign associate, an older, heavily scarred man introduced only as Mr. Petrov, a key player in Eastern European logistics. The dinner was a negotiation, a delicate dance of power and profit. Nora moved with practiced invisibility, pouring water, clearing plates, and anticipating needs before they were spoken. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Silas spoke in low, measured tones with Petrov, discussing container capacities and customs blind spots. Victoria, entirely excluded from the business discussion, sat rigidly in her chair, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the stem of her wine glass. Boredom, for a woman like Victoria, inevitably mutated into cruelty. She began to find faults where none existed. The soup was too tepid. The lighting was giving her a migraine. She loudly complained to Silas that the restaurant's standards had plummeted, all while pointedly glaring at Nora. Silas, entirely focused on a set of complex international shipping manifests spread across his side of the table, offered his wife nothing more than a non-committal hum. This only fueled Victoria's ire. She needed an audience. She needed to feel powerful. "Waitress," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the men's conversation. It was a sharp, grating sound. Nora stepped forward instantly, her expression a mask of polite deference. "Yes, Mrs. Mercer, how may I assist you?" Victoria looked Nora up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of profound disgust. "This table is a disaster. There are crumbs near my bread plate. Are you blind or just hopelessly incompetent?" There were no crumbs. The table was immaculate. Nora knew better than to argue. "My apologies, ma'am. I will clear it immediately." She stepped forward with her crumber, expertly and silently sweeping the pristine tablecloth. "And the wine," Victoria continued, her voice rising in volume, ensuring that both Silas and Petrov stopped their conversation to look at her. She picked up the bottle of 1,982 Chateau Cheval Blanc that Nora had poured earlier. "This hasn't been allowed to breathe properly. It tastes like vinegar, but I suppose I shouldn't expect a girl who probably couldn't point to France on a map to understand the intricacies of decanting a Premier Grand Cru." Silas sighed, a barely audible exhalation of breath, but he did not intervene. He leaned back in his chair, his cold eyes resting on his wife with a look of detached observation. Petrov watched with mild, amused curiosity. "I can certainly bring another bottle, Mrs. Mercer, and have the sommelier personally oversee the decanting process," Nora said evenly, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She needed this job. She could not afford to lose her temper. "Don't bother," Victoria snapped, slamming her glass down on the table. A few drops of the ruby liquid splashed over the rim, staining the white linen. "Just get out of my sight. Fetch the dessert menus, and try to find one with pictures, so you don't confuse the orders again." Nora bowed her head slightly. "Right away, ma'am." She retreated to the service station just outside the room, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of the marble counter. "Think of Dad," she told herself. "Think of the hospital bills. Swallow it down. It's just words." But Victoria Mercer was not finished. Having successfully disrupted the business meeting and drawn the attention back to herself, she was eager to continue the performance. When Nora returned to the obsidian room carrying the leather-bound dessert menus, the atmosphere had shifted. Silas was no longer looking at his documents. He was watching his wife. It was not a gaze of affection. It was the look of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. Nora approached the table, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. She handed the menus out, starting with Victoria. As she reached across the table to place the menu in front of the socialite, Victoria deliberately and forcefully shifted her weight, driving her elbow hard into Nora's forearm. The impact was sudden. The heavy leather menu slipped from Nora's grasp, glancing off the edge of Victoria's water goblet before hitting the table with a loud smack. The goblet tipped, spilling ice water across the pristine tablecloth, narrowly missing Victoria's silk dress. Gasps echoed in the room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Victoria leaped up from her chair, her face flushed with theatrical outrage. "You clumsy, stupid girl," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Look what you've done. You nearly ruined a $10,000 gown." "I am so incredibly sorry, Mrs. Mercer," Nora said quickly, grabbing a fresh linen napkin to stem the flow of water before it reached the shipping manifests near Silas. "It was an accident. I'll have this cleaned up instantly." "An accident?" Victoria laughed, a harsh, grating sound. She stepped closer to Nora, pointing a manicured finger directly in her face. "You did that on purpose because you're bitter. You're a bitter, uneducated little peasant who resents her betters. Victoria. Enough, Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that normally stopped men dead in their tracks. But Victoria, high on her own manufactured drama and desperate to assert her dominance in front of the Russian associate, ignored her husband. No, Silas, I will not have it. Look at her. She's practically drooling on the floor. She turned her venom back to Nora. You are completely useless. Tell me, do you even know how to read? Are you completely illiterate? Is that why you're stuck wearing a cheap polyester uniform, wiping up my spills? I bet you can't even read the words on the menu you just dropped. The word hung in the air. Illiterate. Petrov shifted uncomfortably. Even for the Russian underworld, this display of petty cruelty to the help was distasteful. Silas Mercer simply watched, his face an impenetrable mask, waiting to see how the cornered waitress would react. Most girls would cry. Most would run out of the room. Nora Hayes did neither. The fear that had been keeping her submissive evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She had spent the last 2 years eating dirt, bowing her head to people who possessed a fraction of her intellect, all to keep her family afloat. She had tolerated the grueling hours, the aching feet, and the demanding chefs, but she would not tolerate being called ignorant by a woman whose only achievement was signing a marriage certificate. Nora slowly straightened her spine. The posture of the submissive servant vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of the corporate litigator she was trained to be. She did not raise her voice. She did not glare. She simply looked Victoria directly in the eyes. I can assure you, Mrs. Mercer, my literacy is quite intact, Nora said. Her voice was no longer the soft, deferential tone of a waitress. It was sharp, articulate, and dangerously calm. Victoria blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in the girl's demeanor. Excuse me? Are you talking back to me? Nora ignored her. She calmly reached down and picked up the dropped dessert menu. She flipped it open. Since you inquired about my ability to read, Nora continued, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room, allow me to translate the dessert selections for you. As your pronunciation of the millefeuille earlier suggested, a rather tragic misunderstanding of basic French phonetics. Victoria's jaw dropped. Silas's eyebrows twitched the absolute maximum expression of his surprise. Nora didn't stop. She looked at the menu. Le millefeuille à la vanille de Madagascar. She pronounced perfectly, the French rolling off her tongue with native fluency. It translates to a Madagascar vanilla 1,000-sheet pastry. Though, given your preference for things that are superficially complex but entirely hollow on the inside, I would actually recommend the Sphère en Chocolat. It is visually impressive, but melts into nothing the moment pressure is applied. A sharp, barking laugh escaped Petrov. He slapped a hand over his mouth, but the damage was done. Victoria's face turned a mottled, furious red. How dare you, Victoria, sputtered, looking frantically at Silas. Silas, have this girl fired. Have her thrown out onto the street. Silas, however, did not move. His gray eyes were locked onto Nora, studying her with a sudden, intense fascination. He raised a hand, silencing his wife without looking at her. Let her finish. Nora held Silas's gaze for a fraction of a second, recognizing the shift in power. She stepped away from Victoria and moved toward the center of the table, stopping right next to the scattered shipping manifests Silas had been reviewing all night. My apologies, Mr. Mercer, Nora said, gracefully switching her language. She looked directly at Petrov and spoke in flawless, unaccented Russian. Proшу прощения за эту сцену, господин Petrov. Надеюсь, это не испортит ваше... Vypechatleni od večera. I apologize for this scene, Mr. Petrov. I hope this does not ruin your impression of the evening. Petrov's eyes widened in sheer shock. He sat up straight. Vy govorite po-ruski? You speak Russian? Svobodno. Fluently. Nora replied in Russian, before smoothly transitioning back to English for Silas's benefit. She looked down at the documents spread across the table. They were printed in dual languages, English and Russian. Furthermore, regarding my literacy, Nora said, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon on the open page near Silas's hand. If I were illiterate, I wouldn't be able to read Section 4, Clause 12 of the logistics contract you have sitting in front of you. Silas's demeanor changed instantly. The detached observer vanished, replaced by the lethal syndicate boss. His posture went rigid. What did you say? He demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Nora didn't flinch. She pointed a slender finger at a specific paragraph on the page. The English translation states that liability for seized cargo falls entirely on the distributor, which, based on the context of your conversation, is your syndicate, Mr. Mercer. However, Nora tapped the Russian text next to it. The Cyrillic phrasing in the adjoining column uses a very specific legal loophole. It states that liability falls on the distributor only if the point of origin clears a secondary customs check in Vladivostok. A check that, historically, your associate's shell companies bypass to save on tariffs. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Nora looked up from the papers and met Silas Mercer's cold gray eyes. If you sign this contract as it is currently drafted, Mr. Mercer, you aren't sealing a partnership. You are legally assuming 100% of the financial risk for Mr. Petrov's shipments, while he retains full deniability under Russian jurisdiction. It's a beautifully constructed trap, but to see it, you'd have to be highly literate in international maritime law. And, of course, Russian. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, entirely incapable of comprehending the high-level corporate espionage happening in front of her. Petrov's face had drained of all color. The amused uncle persona had shattered, revealing a panicked, cornered operator. He looked at Silas, opening his hands in a placating gesture. Silas, my friend, this is a misunderstanding, a clerical error by my lawyers. Silas slowly turned his head to look at Petrov. The look in his eyes promised violence of the most methodical kind. He didn't say a word to the Russian. Instead, he reached out, picked up the multi-million-dollar contract, and calmly tore it perfectly in half. He then turned his attention back to the waitress in the cheap polyester uniform. "Who are you?" Silas asked softly. "My name is Nora Hayes," she replied, her voice steady. "And I believe my shift is over." Without waiting for a dismissal, Nora untied her white apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table right next to Victoria's spilled water. She turned on her heel and walked out of the obsidian room, leaving the most powerful man in Chicago, a terrified Russian oligarch, and a thoroughly humiliated socialite in a state of absolute, breathless shock. The heavy oak doors of the obsidian room clicked shut behind Nora Hayes, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The sudden departure of the waitress did not ease the tension. It amplified it. Roman Mercer, the undisputed architect of Chicago's underworld, sat perfectly still. He did not look at the torn halves of the multi-million-dollar logistics contract resting on the white linen. He did not look at his wife, Victoria, who was currently attempting to compose her features into a mask of righteous indignation. His cold, calculating gaze was fixed solely on Mr. Petrov. The Russian oligarch, usually a man of boisterous confidence and intimidating presence, was visibly sweating. The color had drained from his scarred face, leaving his complexion the shade of old parchment. He understood precisely what had just transpired. His intricate, legally bulletproof trap, designed to siphon millions from Mercer's operations while leaving the Chicago syndicate holding the bag for federal seizures, had been dismantled in 60 seconds by a girl in a cheap polyester uniform. "Roman, please," Petrov stammered, abandoning his native tongue in his panic. "This is a gross misinterpretation. A drafting error by incompetent counsel in Moscow. I assure you, my intentions." "Your intentions," Mercer interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, resonant baritone that sent a chill through the room, "were to leverage my infrastructure while insulating your own assets. You relied on the assumption that my legal team would focus on the English translation of a localized maritime dispute clause. It was a calculated risk." Mercer leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "It was also your final one." Mercer raised a single finger. From the shadows near the entrance, two of his most trusted associates, men who moved with the silent, predatory grace of seasoned professionals, stepped forward. "See Mr. Petrov to the airport," Mercer instructed, never taking his eyes off the Russian. "Ensure he boards his private jet, and contact the port authorities in Vladivostok. Inform them that the secondary customs blind spots they've been maintaining for Petrov's shell companies have been compromised. Let the local federal agencies seize his inbound cargo." Petrov gasped, stumbling backward as the two men gripped his arms. "Roman, you cannot do this. It will bankrupt me. The debts I owe back home are no longer my concern," Mercer said coldly. "Consider it a lesson in corporate literacy. Goodbye, Petrov." As the sputtering, desperate Russian was dragged from the room, Victoria Sterling finally found her voice. She had missed the entire nuance of the exchange, her vanity blinding her to the geopolitical and financial earthquake that had just occurred. "Well," Victoria huffed, smoothing down the front of her vintage Dior gown. "Good riddance to both of them. That Russian was dreadfully boring, and that waitress was an absolute psycho. Can you believe the nerve of her? Speaking to me like that? We need to speak to the general manager immediately. She needs to be blacklisted from every establishment in this city." Mercer slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The look in his eyes was devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was a look of absolute, profound void. "You will not speak to the general manager," Mercer said softly. "You will go to the car. You will go back to the penthouse, and you will not speak another word for the rest of the evening." Victoria bristled, her insecurity flaring into defiance. "Excuse me? I am your wife, Roman. You don't dismiss me like one of your thugs. My father, your father," Mercer cut in, the ice in his voice freezing her in place, "is a state senator who is currently desperate for my capital to cover up his gross misappropriation of union pension funds. You are here because of a transaction. Do not mistake a transaction for authority. Go to the car, Victoria." The harsh, unvarnished truth struck Victoria like a physical blow. Her lips trembled, the illusion of her power shattering under the weight of his indifference. Without another word, she gathered her purse and fled the room. Mercer sat alone in the obsidian room for a long time. He pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket and dialed his chief investigator, a former intelligence officer named Harrison. "Harrison," Mercer said when the line connected, "I need a comprehensive background profile. The target is a woman named Nora Hayes. Until 20 minutes ago, she was employed as a waitress here at Le Trianon." "A waitress, sir?" Harrison asked, a hint of confusion bleeding through his strict professionalism. She is fluent in Russian, possesses a master-class understanding of international maritime law, and just saved this syndicate roughly $40 million by spotting a Cyrillic jurisdictional loophole, Mercer explained, staring at the folded white apron Nora had left behind. She is not a waitress. Find out who she really is, who she used to work for, and exactly what forced her into that uniform. I want her entire life on my desk by morning. By 6 a.m. the next day, Mercer was sitting in his high-rise office overlooking the gray expanse of Lake Michigan. On the mahogany desk in front of him lay a thick manila folder. The reality of Nora Hayes's life was starker and far more brutal than he had anticipated. Nora had been a prodigy. She held dual degrees in forensic accounting and international law from Georgetown. 2 years ago, she was the youngest senior analyst at Vanguard Financial Forensics, a prestigious firm in the city. Her father, Thomas Hayes, owned a boutique auditing agency known for its impeccable, unshakable integrity. Then, the floor fell out. Thomas Hayes's agency was contracted to audit a massive, complex real estate development project on the South Side. A month into the audit, federal agents raided Thomas's office. They found meticulously forged documents implicating Thomas in a massive embezzlement scheme. The media crucified him. The stress triggered a catastrophic, debilitating stroke that left him paralyzed and requiring round-the-clock life support care. In the fallout, Nora's firm panicked and fired her to avoid the PR nightmare. Blacklisted from the corporate world, her accounts drained by exorbitant legal defense fees and the crushing weight of her father's uninsured medical bills, Nora was forced into the shadows. The girl who used to unravel offshore tax havens was now working 80-hour weeks carrying trays to keep her father's ventilator running. It was a textbook corporate assassination. Someone had framed Thomas Hayes to cover their own tracks, and they had destroyed his daughter in the process. Mercer closed the file. He didn't feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion in his world. He felt an intense, calculating respect. Nora Hayes had been stripped of her wealth, her career, and her reputation. Yet when backed into a corner by his arrogant wife, she hadn't flinched. She had struck back with surgical precision. She was exactly what he needed. The steady, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in room 412 of the St. Jude long-term care facility. It was a bleak, sterile place, smelling faintly of bleach and old regrets. Nora sat in a plastic chair beside her father's bed, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She held Thomas's limp, unresponsive hand, her thumb gently tracing his knuckles. The reality of her situation was crashing down on her. Walking out of Le Trianon had been a moment of fierce, necessary pride. But the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind cold terror. She was unemployed. Her rent was due in 3 days, and, most pressingly, she held a final notice from the facility's billing department in her lap. If she didn't provide a payment of $15,000 by the end of the week, they would transfer her father to a state-run ward, a death sentence for a man in his fragile condition. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, a single tear cutting a track down her pale cheek. I lost my temper. I couldn't let her talk to me like that anymore. But I don't know what we're going to do now. The sound of heavy, measured footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway made her pause. The footsteps stopped outside the open door. Nora turned, her breath catching in her throat. Roman Mercer stood in the doorway. He looked entirely out of place in the depressing, fluorescent-lit hospital room. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, his presence commanding and entirely unreadable. Nora immediately stood up, her defensive instincts flaring. "Mr. Mercer, if you've come to ensure I'm blacklisted from the hospitality industry, you can save your breath." I'm well aware of how these things work. Mercer stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping over the medical equipment before settling on Nora. I have no interest in your career in hospitality, Miss Hayes. It was a severe misallocation of your talents. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, and placed it on the small tray table next to the bed. What is that? Nora asked, not moving toward it. A cashier's check, Mercer replied smoothly. Made out to this facility. It covers your father's outstanding balance, as well as prepaying for the next 5 years of his care. Upgraded to their private, top-tier medical suite. Nora stared at the envelope, her mind racing. Why? I saved you money last night, yes, but you owe me nothing. Men like you don't do favors out of the goodness of their hearts. I don't have a good heart, Miss Hayes, Mercer stated factually. I am a businessman. I am here to make an acquisition. I read your file this morning. Nora stiffened, her posture rigid. Then you know I'm untouchable. My name is tied to a federal fraud investigation. My father's agency was ruined. I know your father was framed. Mercer corrected her, his tone sharpening. I know the evidence was planted. And I know that whoever orchestrated that framing has deep pockets and exceptional legal cover. But more importantly, I know you possess a unique combination of forensic accounting expertise, legal fluency, and a very specific kind of anger. He stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up into his cold, gray eyes. My syndicate is transitioning, Mercer explained quietly. I am legitimizing my core assets, but my internal books are a mess of shadow accounts, hidden liabilities, and associates like Petrov who are skimming off the top. I need a forensic auditor who understands the underworld, someone who can track phantom money, restructure my legal fronts, and bleed out the parasites in my organization. Nora swallowed hard. You want me to be the mob's accountant? I want you to be my chief financial architect, Mercer corrected. You will have full autonomy, an unlimited budget, and absolute protection. And if I refuse, you are free to decline. The check remains yours. Consider it a consulting fee for the maritime loophole, Mercer said, turning as if to leave. However, before you make a final decision, you should look at the second document in that envelope. Nora hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers and tore the envelope open. Behind the cashier's check was a small, heavily redacted dossier. My investigators dug into the real estate project your father was auditing before the raid. Mercer's voice floated from the doorway. The developers were using a labyrinth of shell companies to hide the fact that the project was entirely bankrupt. They were embezzling union pension funds to keep it afloat. Nora scanned the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the financial diagrams and corporate structures. Who owned the shell companies? She demanded, her eyes flying across the text. The funds traced back to an offshore holding group based in the Cayman Islands, Mercer said softly. A holding group solely controlled by Senator Sterling. The name hit Nora like a freight train. The file slipped from her fingers. Senator Sterling. Victoria's father, the socialite who had humiliated her, who had called her illiterate and useless, was wearing diamonds bought with the money stolen from Nora's father. Victoria's entire life of privilege was built on the ashes of Thomas Hayes's reputation and health. A profound, chilling silence descended on the hospital room. The sadness and desperation that had plagued Nora for 2 years evaporated in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a cold, searing fire. The universe wasn't just cruel. It was poetic in its cruelty. Hard karma had just knocked on her door, wearing a bespoke suit. She looked up from the scattered papers on the floor, meeting Mercer's gaze. The hesitation was gone from her eyes. You want me to audit your empire, Nora said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I, though, Mercer confirmed. And if I find leaks connected to your wife's family? Nora asked. If I find that the senator is using your syndicate to launder the money he stole from my father, Mercer's expression remained perfectly impassive, but a dark, terrifying glint appeared in his eyes. A genuine partnership, born not of romance, but of mutual, ruthless ambition. If you find that, Miss Hayes, Mercer said, then you will drain every single cent from his accounts. You will dismantle his legacy piece by piece. You will destroy them legally. Mercer paused, the ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips. While I destroy them financially, Nora looked at her father's motionless form, then back to the billionaire syndicate boss standing before her. She didn't need a high-rise corner office anymore. She had just found a much better battleground. When do I start? 6 months later, the main hall of the Field Museum of Natural History was a glittering sea of champagne and profound hypocrisy. The Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala was the undisputed crown jewel of Chicago's high society calendar. At the lucite podium, Senator William Sterling delivered a booming, impassioned speech about ethical leadership and community trust. At the premier VIP table, seated directly in front of the flashing press cameras, Victoria Sterling held court. Draped in custom emerald green silk and dripping in borrowed diamonds, she was entirely oblivious to the legally binding noose rapidly tightening around her family's empire. Roman Mercer arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. But he did not arrive alone. Nora Hayes no longer wore a cheap polyester uniform. She wore a tailored, midnight blue gown that moved like liquid glass. Her posture radiated the lethal, quiet grace of a woman who now held the city's financial heartbeat firmly in her hands. As Roman's chief financial architect, she had spent the last 180 days locked in a secure server room, methodically dismantling the Sterling family's offshore labyrinth piece by piece. When Roman and Nora approached the VIP table, the superficial chatter died instantly. Victoria's triumphant smile curdled. She recognized the face, but the aura of absolute, unyielding authority confused her. Roman, Victoria hissed, standing abruptly. What is the meaning of this? Why are you parading the help around my father's gala? Have her removed by security immediately. Roman didn't answer. He simply stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to his partner. Nora stepped forward and calmly placed a sleek, black tablet onto the table, directly amidst the crystal champagne flutes. Good evening, Victoria, Nora said, her voice crisp and resonant. Since you were so deeply concerned with my literacy during our last encounter, I brought some reading material. I thought it only fair to return the favor. Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you are trespassing. Nora tapped the screen. This is a real-time feed of the federal court docket. Precisely 4 minutes ago, a grand jury unsealed a 70-page indictment against Senator Sterling. The charges include federal racketeering, wire fraud, and the gross embezzlement of public union pension funds. Victoria laughed nervously. You're clinically insane. My father is untouchable. He was untouchable, Roman corrected smoothly, his deep voice slicing through the rising panic. Until my lead forensic accountant provided the FBI with the exact offshore IP addresses and the original audit reports your father suppressed to frame Thomas Hayes. Victoria's eyes darted frantically. You went to the FBI? Roman, you run a syndicate. You'd go to prison too. I run a highly diversified, legitimate logistics conglomerate, Roman countered, a dark, predatory smirk touching his lips. Miss Hayes has spent the last 6 months ensuring every single one of my accounts is pristine and fully taxed. Your father, however, was incredibly sloppy. Nora leaned in slightly. But here is the real plot twist, Victoria. Your father didn't just use corporate shell companies to hide his theft. He needed a clean, domestic entity to funnel the stolen money back into the United States. He used your personal trust fund. Victoria's face drained of all color. I just sign what my wealth manager puts in front of me. I don't read the account transfers. Willful ignorance is not a recognized legal defense for money laundering, Nora said evenly. By legally binding your signature to those massive cash injections, you are listed as a primary co-conspirator. You didn't just wear the money stolen from my father, Victoria. You actively washed it. Right on cue, the massive brass doors of the museum burst open. A dozen agents in dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned across the back marched into the gala. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Senator Sterling was pulled from the podium mid-sentence, his microphone tumbling to the floor with a deafening thud as his hands were yanked behind his back. Victoria gasped, pure terror shattering her facade. She grabbed Roman's arm, her nails digging desperately into his tuxedo jacket. "Roman, call your lawyers. You have to protect me. I am your wife." Roman looked down at her clutching hands, then met her terrified eyes with absolute chilling indifference. "Our prenuptial agreement contains a strict morality clause," Roman stated coldly. "Any federal indictments immediately nullify the contract. I had my attorneys file the annulment paperwork this morning. You are no longer my wife. You are a liability." He firmly peeled her trembling fingers off his sleeve. Two federal agents approached the table, their badges flashing. "Victoria Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Place your hands behind your back." As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists, she looked back at Nora. There was no screaming. There was only the hollow, crushing realization of utter defeat. The uneducated waitress she had humiliated had systematically erased her entire existence. Nora watched silently as the agents led the ruined socialite away. The burning anger that had fueled her survival for the last 2 years finally dissolved, replaced by a settling peace. Her father's name would be cleared by morning, and his care was secured for life. Roman stepped beside her, offering his arm. "The atmosphere in this room has become terribly stale. Shall we go, Miss Hayes?" Nora smiled a sharp, dangerous expression and slipped her hand through his arm. "Lead the way, Mr. Mercer. We have an empire to restructure tomorrow." The transition from a humiliated waitress to the architect of a syndicate's legitimate future proved that true power doesn't lie in loud insults or inherited wealth. Nora's methodical retaliation completely dismantled the corrupt foundations of those who sought to destroy her family, forged a formidable partnership born from calculated, devastating justice.